We're diving into a really tough story today, one that comes straight from the heart of Nairobi. It's a story that, believe it or not, starts with a single word, no, and ends with a gunshot in a crowded cyber cafe. This is about what happens when one woman's dream of independence runs headfirst into a man's obsession with control, a man who happens to be backed by the full power of the state. So let's get right into it. So picture this, a street in Nairobi, absolutely packed, buzzing with energy. This is a place where thousands of people's lives just crisscross every single day. It's the definition of ordinary. And then, in just a blink of an eye, all of that normal, everyday noise, it just gets completely shattered by an act of brutal, shocking violence. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to break down everything that led up to this awful moment. We'll look at the people at the center of it all, and maybe, just maybe, see the warning signs that everyone seemed to miss. Now, to really get a grip on how this happened, we actually have to start at the end. We're going to start with that brutal public act of violence that finally dragged this very private story out into the open. So, if you were there, what you would have seen was a horrifying murder-suicide attempt right in the middle of a busy cyber cafe. But here's the thing, and this is so important. This explosion of violence, it wasn't random at all. Nope. It was actually the final terrible chapter of a story that had been building and building for months. And to even begin to understand that story, we have to start with the victim, Anne Wanjohi. It is absolutely crucial that we see her as more than just a statistic. She was a young woman with a whole life and her own dreams. So, who was Anne? Well, her friends called her Wanja. She was in her early 20s, and if you ever went to that cyber cafe, you'd know her. She was that steady, friendly, but super efficient person behind the counter. But she was so much more than her job. She was a provider. I mean, her siblings, they counted on her, and that's a heavy responsibility she carried with this incredible, quiet strength. And this quote from one of her friends, man, it just says it all, doesn't it? She had these big dreams, ambitions that were way bigger than the four walls of that cafe. She wasn't just working to get by. No, she was quietly saving up, planning for a future that she was going to build all by herself, on her own terms. And this right here is such a powerful picture of her independence. You got to remember, in a world with all these expectations, every time she politely said, "not yet," to marriage, that wasn't just about timing. It was her setting a boundary. It was about her having control. Every single shilling she saved was like a vote for her own future, a quiet little declaration that her life was going to be her own design. Okay, so now we have to talk about the other person in the story, Police Constable Samuel Jorro. And look, to even begin to understand his actions, we have to look at the world he lived in, the immense pressure, the identity, everything that was tied up in that uniform he wore. Now, Samuel wasn't just any cop on the beat. No way. He was part of the Presidential Escort Unit. This is an absolutely elite, high-stakes world where control is literally everything. I mean, these are the guys trained to be a human shield, the final barrier between any threat and the head of state. They don't just have power, they are the image of state power. And on paper, Samuel looked like the perfect officer. He's in his mid-30s, has a totally clean record, and his colleagues saw him as this quiet, professional guy. You know the type, the kind of person with that steady gaze, someone who's been trained to spot threats from a mile away and to keep his cool, no matter what. But here's where it gets complicated. The guy was living two totally different lives. When he put on that uniform, he was a symbol of the state, a person with immense authority. But when he took it off, he was just another face in the Nairobi crowd. And here's the crucial part. That mindset, the discipline, the training, the need for absolute control, that doesn't just get switched off when you hang up your uniform at the end of the day. So you have to ask, what happens when these two people, these two completely different worlds, collide? Well, this is where we get into the relationship itself, this toxic mix of Anne's fierce drive for independence and Samuel's ingrained professional need for control. At first, it all seemed pretty normal. He was just a customer at the cafe. But then his visits got more and more frequent, until he was just always there, a constant presence. And then came the moment that changed everything. He asked her to marry him, and she said no. For her, it was simple. She wasn't ready, she had her own future to build. But for him, it seems like her no wasn't just a refusal. It was a direct challenge to his authority. And this observation from her friend is so telling. He was basically treating their relationship like it was one of his security assignments. Think about it. All those traits that make a great protection officer, being persistent, always watching, having this commanding presence. Well, in a personal relationship, that starts to feel a whole lot like being in a cage. And this is the chilling, step-by-step breakdown of how it all fell apart. Her no wasn't just a rejection. To a man who was literally trained to expect and enforce compliance, it was an act of defiance. So on that day, September 16th, he left his post. He took his service weapon with him, a tool of state power, and he walked into her workplace. And the witnesses? They all said he seemed perfectly calm, professional even. That mask he wore was still firmly in place. What happened next was over in seconds. Just brutally fast. But the fallout? Well, the aftermath left behind some huge, deeply disturbing questions, not just for the public, but for the police force itself. With a single, smooth motion, a movement he'd practiced 1,000 times in training, he raised his gun. The first shot shattered the quiet hum of the cafe. Anne died instantly. And then chaos. As people screamed and ran, he turned the gun on himself. He would survive that shot, at least for a while. So in the immediate aftermath, here's the situation. Anne was dead at the scene. Samuel was alive, but in critical condition and already under police guard at the hospital. And the weapon, his state-issued Cheska pistol, was now the single most important piece of evidence in an investigation that was just getting started. And pretty quickly, the investigation started to look beyond just the crime scene. People started asking bigger systemic questions. Like, how on earth was an officer who was so clearly emotionally volatile still allowed to carry a loaded weapon? What kind of psychological checks are there for these elite units, really? And you have to wonder, did his colleagues see the warning signs and just say nothing? And that right there is why this story is so much bigger than just two people. This wasn't just some tragic domestic dispute. This was a complete failure of a system. It's a story about what can happen when a person's private sense of entitlement gets backed up by state-sanctioned power and a gun. And this really gets to the most crucial takeaway of all. Anne's story, as tragic as it is not some one-off event. The sad reality is that when a woman in a relationship with an armed partner tries to leave, the risk she faces goes way, way up. The presence of that weapon just changes the entire equation. So it leaves us with this one final, really difficult question. A uniform is supposed to mean protection, right? It's a symbol of order. But what happens when the person wearing it becomes the predator? It forces all of us to ask, who is watching the watchers? Who is policing the very people we trust to keep us safe?